continuing on with rationalism, or in the section of the notes that deal with Rene Descartes. So we're fast forwarding with Socrates and Plato are a couple hundred years before Jesus, and now we're coming into Rene Descartes, and he is a French Catholic philosopher whose dates of existence, are 1596 to 1650. So we're going ahead almost 1,000 years. But like I said, these philosophies and these cycles of thought, while there are kind of readjustments and rearrangements and some new ideas, they kind of go in cycles, because people get frustrated with the problems of one philosophy, and they say, okay, well, let's try to develop again another school of philosophical thought. So even Descartes and Spinoza and the people of the Enlightenment, which is influential in Britain and the United States, or what would become the United States and the American colonies, are coming back to a problem that was identified even in ancient Greek philosophy and before that, of trying to say there has to be this reality of reason by which humans can know things, can arrive at certainty or truth about reality and how we know what we know. And so we're going to continue with that, with what's called continental rationalism, which just means it was on the continent of Europe during the time pretty much of the Enlightenment, which is very influential on the founders of America, people like James Madison, Thomas Jefferson. All of those men were Enlightenment men, and they reflect an Enlightenment thinking, which has some good things about it, but it also has some significant problems, we'll see, because it's not submitted to God's authority. But we're going to talk about Rene Descartes, whose famous statement we'll get to is, "I think, therefore I am," and we'll talk about why he said that and how he arrived at that conclusion. And then we'll also see if that, does that hold up? What does he mean by that? And does it actually work? Does that hold up? So he's a French Catholic, so he's not opposed to God and Christianity. He's not like an ancient Greek pagan philosopher like Socrates and Plato, and he doesn't view himself as an opponent to Christianity, but he does remove the kind of what you might call the locus of authority from God and the scriptures to reason and thinking. And so in doing so, he's undermining the truth of Christianity. So he really liked math, and so he was looking for the type of certainty in the world through reason that you can arrive at, like in mathematics, that 2 plus 2 is 4. Okay, can we have that also in every area of thought, that the certainty you can get at through mathematical thought, can that pervade everything else such that your thinking is totally certain and reasonable just like that? So any truth that you would say about God or metaphysics, which is the nature of reality, or epistemology, which is how we know what we know, or ethics, which is how we live, anything like that, can you get to mathematical certainties? So that if you say you should do X, it's like saying 2 plus 2 is 4, that in ethical language. So anyway, he emphasizes the reality of universals, universal truths, or objective universal principles about the nature of reality, and we would agree. But this is one of those things that in philosophy, if you want to be a good philosopher, what someone says that we may agree with, we want to not just agree with some of their conclusions, but we want to make sure that they got to their conclusions in a way that is justified and makes sense. That they, even if they get to the same conclusion as we do about some things, like you may say, okay, yeah, I agree that there's the reality of universals, that there's universal truth and universal objective principles. That's true, but how did Descartes arrive at those principles? So anyway, he also talks about that the final test of truth was the principle of logical non-contradiction, which is one of the first rules of logic that we use all the time without consciously thinking about it. It's just that truth does not contradict itself, that something cannot be one thing and not that thing at the same time in the same relationship. So for example, it would be saying something like God created himself. It's a logical contradiction. God would have to exist and not exist to create himself. So that you recognize that that's a logical contradiction. So, or having a square, as a square is defined, triangle. That's a logical contradiction. So we notice a square cannot be a square and a triangle at the same time and in the same relationship. So we'd agree with the law of contradiction, but he says that's the test of all truth. And then he did not have an appreciation for or derogated what we would call perception or sense experience or empiricism, meaning a lot of these other thinkers, the next lesson we'll get into is all about empiricism, that they get frustrated with rationalism. They say, okay, well, you're all saying reason, but you all have different definitions of reason. You all come to radically different conclusions about where you say reason leads you. And you're saying that reason is this unchanging thing, but it's in the mind of man, and the mind of man is changing. So therefore, you can't get to it if you depend on a changing standard. It's a moving target at that point. And so, but the rationalists, like Descartes, they say, well, wait a second. Sense experience, what we see through our eyes, what we hear through our ears, what we feel and stuff like that, that is vulnerable to being misled, to being tricked. Plus, you can only experience a very limited amount of data and information. And just because you experience it doesn't mean you'll interpret it correctly. So for example, we can't be everywhere at once. We can't experience everything at once. We can't experience things from the past that happened before we were born. And we can't experience things that happen after we die. So Descartes says, look, your senses can be tricked. They can be misled. So the rationalists say, if you try to follow sense experience too much, you can observe some things and hold them to be valid, but you never know whether or not what you're experiencing is actually accurate or not, or will lead you to truth or not. And so the senses could be misled. Descartes is even going to get into the point where he says that you should doubt everything, and you could even doubt your own existence. I mean, how do you really know whether or not you exist? That this is one of those dumb things that philosophy professors like to bring up. Like, I had a teacher, he was a good guy, he was a political class, but he's like, how do you know your car is still in the parking lot? How do you know you're not in somebody else's dream and that you don't really exist? That type of thing. We don't really live that way, but so anyway, he wanted to say, but if he wanted to arrive at all his conclusions by reason. So how do you know that you exist without using, sense experience? And so he also assumes whatever is real is rational. Whatever is in the nature of reality must be rational. So we talked about the realities of universals, final test of the principle of contradiction, looks down on sense experience, and then whatever is real is rational. But here's some problems already with, not to get too far into this yet, but how does he prove any of this? He doesn't prove any of this yet by reason. When he just makes the statement, whatever is real is rational, he's just making a statement and he's assuming that at the outset without proving it by reason. So he's saying reason needs to prove everything, but here are all my statements of what I'm going to assume without using reason to prove them. So he undermines right from the beginning his own system. He doesn't demonstrate or prove any of this. even if we agree with him, he doesn't show why it must be true. So he introduces this idea, and this is a blank that you have on your note packet there. Descartes introduces this idea of what's called methodological doubt.
Is that rationalism can be summarized as?
Rationalism can be summarized as?
I'm just looking for the
Blank.
blank.
We're a little further down underneath that.
Oh, I got it. It's in.
Yeah, we're under Descartes, which his name should be bolded there.
Yeah.
And then it's the first blank under there. There might even be two blanks. So it's under Descartes. There's that list of 1 to 4. Do you see that? And then there's a question. And then there's the starting point of this version of rationalism can be summarized as, and then the statement, methodological doubt.
What page?
6.
Oh, I'm sorry.
Summarized as a statement is at the bottom.
Yes. So the starting point, do you have that sentence? The starting point for this version of rationalism can be summarized as, is everybody there? Okay. Methodological doubt. Okay, so it's not that complicated. It sounds like fancy, but really all this is doubt everything that you think you know until you get to principles that you just absolutely cannot doubt to be true. That's basically what he gets down to. You would strip back everything that you think you know until you get down to something that cannot be doubted because it has to be true. And so he would say, and that is then the principle that you would judge everything else by, or what we would call an ultimate authority. So he says, okay, I can't really know anything to be true, even my own existence. Doubt everything but that which cannot be doubted, then work from that principle to say, okay, now building from there, how do I get to other reality? Okay, so this is his way of thinking. And so he comes up with this Latin phrase, cogito ergo sum, which means I think, therefore I am, or I think, therefore I exist. And that's actually a blank that you have there, the famous statement of Descartes, which was his contribution to rationalistic philosophy, was cogito ergo sum in Latin, or in English, I think, therefore I am. I think, therefore I exist. Okay, so it's actually kind of interesting how he arrives at this conclusion, because if you were doubting even your own existence, this phrase can also be rephrased as I doubt, therefore I am. In Latin it would be dubito ergo sum. Because even if you doubt your own existence, he reasons, who is doubting? Well, I am doubting. And if I can doubt my own existence, then I have to exist. That's where he comes up with it, which is actually, it is kind of clever. We'll talk about the problem. But yeah, I think I have it even in there. Even if I doubt my own existence, who is doubting? I am. I doubt, or I think, therefore I exist. Right? So in a fuller version, let me read you his quote from his writings here, that he explains this a little bit further. He goes, as long as we are doubting, we cannot doubt that we exist. And this is the first thing we know when philosophizing methodologically or methodically. Okay, so he says, all right, the first thing you start with is doubt of everything until you get to your own existence. But we're going to point out later, his reference point of all truth and reality is going to be his own existence. And that's not where we'd agree with him, that's the starting point of all truth and reality is not Descartes' existence or our existence, but God's being and existence. But he goes on, and if you think how he does reason in an interesting way through this, he says, thus, by rejecting all those things we can in any way doubt, and even pretending that they are false, reject all things you think you know, we easily suppose that there is no God, that there are no heavens or bodies, that we ourselves have no hands, no feet, nor indeed any body at all, but not, however, in such a way that we who think these thoughts are nothing. For it is impossible for us to think that whatever thinks does not exist during that very time that it thinks. Okay? So he says, therefore, despite the most extravagant assumptions, we cannot prevent ourselves from believing this inference, this knowledge, I am thinking, therefore I exist, is the foremost and most certain that occurs to anyone who philosophizes methodically. So he says that really your starting point, even if you doubt your own existence, you're still there doubting it, therefore you exist, and that's the fundamental point of all reasoning. And so just think about that for a minute. It is a clever solution in a way, and I'll actually show that this way can, I think, be used, this method of argument can be used in an appropriate way, but I don't think Descartes uses it in an appropriate way, because he's making his being and existence the reference point for reason and all reality. And there are also things which we'll point out, if thinking is the basis of existence, or at least shows that we exist, there are things that exist that don't think, like rocks. So rocks don't have an awareness of their existence. So I think that's a problem that arises there. But this is what's called a self-referential starting point that, which kind of makes sense. The first, things we're aware of, really. We're aware of ourselves, our own thoughts, our own being and existence, our own feelings, our own experiences and sense perceptions since we're born and grow up, and that's how we experience the world is through ourselves. We're individuals, so that makes some sense. But he also, where we would differ is that we would not say that our reason should be self-referential, meaning starting from the point of ourselves and our existence and our thinking, and then from there building to everything else. Because so he would go on, he didn't deny the existence of God, but remember, he starts with saying you could even doubt the existence of God, the existence of creation, all this stuff, and he ultimately comes back to I think or I doubt, therefore I exist. And that's something that he knows as his ultimate authority, is that reasoning from that point. Now from there, he argued that you could reason to the knowledge of God, then the knowledge of the rest of creation. But it always started with yourself. It always started with man and his own independent thinking. He also concluded the nature of reality was dualistic. This isn't like a hugely important point, but it'll become important later. Meaning that he believed that there was this kind of physical world and non-physical world, the world of mind and body, and that reality had this kind of distinction between these two main sections, the physical reality and the non-physical reality. But he couldn't explain how they worked together. Because even if you get to all that stuff and you say, okay, reason, kind of like Plato and Socrates, they have all these ideas of the world of forms and reason and the soul and all this stuff. But how do you put that together with, we also exist in a world of body and sense experience and feeling and thinking, and we're a brain that thinks thoughts and stuff like that as well. So how do those two things meet together and interact with one another? And that was one of the difficulties he had on thinking about this, because is our mind, I use that word carefully in distinction from the word brain, is our mind thinking physical things? Like when our mind thinks, there's biology and chemistry going on here. But is that all that there is? Is thinking physical or non-physical? So he had that problem of kind of putting that together. And I believe the Bible kind of demonstrates, although there could be some believing disagreement on this, that that since God creates us uniquely as mind and body, that those two things go together, that we have that experience of being a mind and a body, that God has created us in his image to exist in that unique way. But he couldn't say how one affects the other. And there's this little proverb or poem about how to figure out what exactly thinking is. Is it just what your brain does, or is there more to it? And I know R.C. Sproul has quoted this before. I don't know who originally said it, but they say, well, what is mind? No matter, meaning it's no physical matter, but like no matter also, it's kind of a play on words. And then what is matter? Never mind, meaning is that these two things don't connect to each other, but they connect somehow, but you don't always know how. And that was what Descartes had a problem with. But anyway, we've talked about before, philosophically, knowledge has to be justified true belief. Your belief has to be true, but it has to be true for the right reasons. So even if a belief is true, it's not allowed to be arbitrary. So in other words, if you believe the truth for the right reasons, therefore, even if we agree that, there's reasons, there's the reality of universals, even if we agree that whatever is real is rational, or whatever Descartes may have said, we want to critique his way of getting there as well. And so we'll look at these things. How can these things be known or proven? Number one, without assuming them to be true. And then we'll also ask the question, is self an appropriate and valid starting point for evaluating reality? Is it really a good idea as humans, it is fair to say we don't have a ton of other options. You have to go from yourself, in a sense, because that's your individual mind and body. However, what I'm asking is self really the test by which you judge all things? And I think we'd agree the answer is no. Self is not the appropriate starting point, and you run into some problems. So let's look a little bit more at his "I think, therefore I am" statement, and ask, is this valid reasoning? I think, therefore I am. Let me put it this way, not too formally, but he puts his premise here. I think okay, that's premise number one, or I doubt, okay? And then his conclusion is I am, or I exist. So, and then what puts it together, that therefore, if I think, therefore I must exist, because it's me who's thinking, it's me who's doubting. Even if I doubt I exist, I'm still there to doubt it. Makes some sense. However, here's a problem with his reasoning, okay? That this is where you get into circular reasoning or question begging, which is when somebody assumes something that they say they're trying to prove. It's something that happens in argumentation all the time, is people start out by assuming something and then showing, and I also get to this conclusion, but you're not allowed to start with your assumption in your premise and then say, therefore I prove it, because that's begging the question. You haven't proven anything. You're just because you already assumed it to be true in the first place. But I think, therefore I exist. Notice this, he runs into a problem with the very first word. He already assumes his own existence. I think, therefore I exist. So before he thinks, he's already referencing himself. He's already saying, I think. So he's assuming existence and then thinking to prove existence. And so it falls apart because existence is already assumed, I think, before he shows that I exist because I know that I'm thinking. So self and existence have to be assumed before thinking according to the argument. So Descartes' famous statement, which is kind of clever, and I'll show how Augustine actually used this, and I think in a way that's appropriate. It begs the question. So people think that this is very clever reasoning. However, it's logically self-contradicting. It is true that if you doubt your own existence, you are the one there that is doubting, so you cannot doubt that you exist. However, it does not serve as an ultimate authority by which to build the rest of truth about reality or truth about anything else. So self and existence have to be assumed before thinking according to this argument. So this type of rationalism assumes what it seeks to prove, and therefore his rationalism is self-defeating. Like all worldviews are, besides the biblical worldview, I say it's nice of other worldviews because they build in, they're self-destructive. They give you their own destruction in them, and then the Bible is true because of the impossibility of the contrary. It's the only thing that, only worldview that can be true, that all other worldviews have to depend on in order to make any sense. But then they run into these issues within themselves that causes them to collapse. In addition to that, I also mentioned that it's an incomplete system of judging all reality and existence by thinking, because it's incomplete because there are things that exist without thinking. Rocks, trees, and other physical things that can exist without this marker does not think about existing, as far as I know. It doesn't, but it exists, right? So, which I guess we could be real skeptical and doubt that this marker exists and say, all you're having right now is a sense experience of seeing it, and I can see it and feel it. But anyway, deal with that another time. Kind of interesting. There's an argument, I think a fairly strong argument, that Descartes actually plagiarized this argument and didn't give credit, which a lot of thinkers do. He plagiarized it, arguably, I can't prove it, but from Augustine. Augustine used it in a different context. Augustine, who, remember, was alive during the 400s, and we talked about him during the church history class, had a lot of his teachings on the nature of grace and God's sovereignty and salvation. Were huge for laying the groundwork later of the Reformation and things like that. Not that he didn't have his inconsistencies and problems as well, like we all do. But Augustine used this type of reasoning in a different way, and I think actually an appropriate way. He was dealing with skeptics. He was dealing with skepticism, the people that said, you can't know anything to be true. You can't even know that you exist. There's nothing you can know. And therefore, you can do whatever you want. You don't have to be stuck with one, philosophical system or one religion or anything like that. That no one can really know anything. And Augustine actually writes in his City of God, I have a quote here from him. He was dealing with this worldview of academic skepticism, that's capital A. It was a specific type of skepticism during that time that questioned all possibility of any knowledge of objective truth whatsoever, even knowledge of our own existence. Now, they didn't live that way, but they played that philosophical game to sidestep accountability of any truth. So people do that on the college campus all the time. That's just one place, but just when you try to present biblical truth to them, and as soon as that truth kind of weighs upon them, they say, but no one can know anything to be true. but they'll tell you all these different things, but then say, so they want you to accept truth when it's something unrelated, but as soon as that truth comes and bears upon their life, they say, well, no one can really know anything. But Augustine uses this argumentation to kind of hold people's feet to the fire, and they say, well, Augustine, you could be wrong. You could be wrong about these things, but listen to how he argues this. This is in his City of God. He says, but the certainty that I exist, that I know it, and that I am glad of it is independent of any imaginary or deceptive fantasies. Like, how do we know we really exist? Some people ask that. He says, in respect of those truths, I have no fear of the arguments of the academics. As people say, you can't even know you exist. You could be wrong about existing. He says, they say, suppose you are mistaken. What if you're wrong about existing? What if you're wrong about everything? And he goes, I reply, if I am mistaken, I exist. A non-existent being cannot be mistaken. Therefore, I must exist if I am mistaken. Then since my being mistaken proves that I exist, how can I be mistaken in thinking that I exist, seeing that my mistake establishes my existence? A little wordy there, but he's really just saying, look, all these skeptics think that they're brilliant, saying, well, how do you really know if you exist? What if you're wrong? He goes, if I'm wrong, I have to exist in order to be wrong. So he's doing an internal critique of their worldview and showing that it's stupid, and showing that, yeah, of course you know truth. Of course you know absolute truth. Of course people know the truth of their existence. Because even if I'm wrong, I exist. So that's, I think, an appropriate way to use it. He goes on, he says, since therefore I must exist in order to be mistaken, then even if I am mistaken, there can be no doubt that I am mistaken in my knowledge that I exist. It follows that I am not mistaken in knowing anything that I know, for just as I know that I exist, I also know that I know. So he's saying, so he had a different angle on it. He's dealing with these extreme skeptics that say, well, you can't really know anything to be true. And he says, of course you can. And by your own admission, you say that you can know those things to be true. Your worldview falls apart. Now, Descartes comes about and he says, okay, let's try to use that argumentation for the foundation of all reality. And once you do that, it ceases to be a tool and starts to become an authority, and it falls apart under its own weight. And he didn't cite a source and say, well, Augustine said this, 1,000 years ago, or more like, about 1,000 years ago from Descartes. But anyway, people do this in philosophy and stuff. He did, so if he turned in his paper to turnitin.com, he would have gotten flagged with City of God and gotten in trouble with his teacher. But he was just writing a book, so nobody cared. So the main biblical problem, let's talk about with this type of rationalistic argument. So we agree that we think. We agree that even if we doubt that we exist, that's all true. But we don't agree that self is the ultimate starting point for reasoning, and that knowledge, we would say that self is not the ultimate starting point for reasoning. We do use ourselves in reasoning, right? We have to. We would say it's not the ultimate starting point, but rather the proximate. And this isn't a blank, but the proximate starting point. Meaning we don't start with ourselves as the ultimate reality, but we experience thinking within ourselves. Great theologian and apologist Cornelius Van Til, he called this kind of like the diving board. He says, look, you could be standing on a diving board, and your awareness may be that you look down and you see that your feet are on the diving board. But as soon as you see that, you're aware that the diving board is connected to the ground. And so he says that that's the proximate starting point. You know you're on the diving board. That's your thinking. That's your self-awareness. That's your knowledge of your own existence and your own thinking. But as soon as you're aware of that, really you have to be aware of the fact that there's got to be more to it than that. That your thinking has to be connected with a larger reality, and has to be connected with the God who makes that type of thinking possible. Let me give you some scriptures here. And before I do that, there's just a statement. Biblically, we exist within God's world, and we know God as we know ourselves, and we also know ourselves as we know God. Those two distinct elements of knowledge go together. We know ourselves as existing, but we know ourselves as God's creation. And as we know ourselves, we exist within His world, we also have a knowledge of God. Now, it's distorted by sin, where we resist that knowledge of God and distort that knowledge of God, but it's inescapable. Paul in Acts 17:28, when he's giving his sermon in Athens on Mars Hill, in Acts 17:28, he says, "For in Him, in God, we live and move and exist," or have our being, or literally just the word there, are. It's in God that we live, move, and have our being. It's because God exists, not that we exist, and that forms the foundation for all reality. It's that God exists, and we exist within His world and know Him. Romans 1:19, familiar verse, "Because that which is known about God is evident within them, for God made it evident to them." So we have this internal, infallible knowledge of God. And when I say infallible, I don't mean like the Bible's infallible. What I mean is that the knowledge of God has not failed to make its impression known in our hearts, that we know God. And so even as we are aware of our own existence, we're aware of the God who created us. John Calvin also talked about this in his Institutes. We also talked about John Calvin in the church history class. He talks about our wisdom, insofar as it ought to be deemed true and solid, consists almost entirely of two parts: the knowledge of God and the knowledge of ourselves. He said, "But as these are connected together by many ties, it is not easy to determine which of the two proceeds and gives birth to the other." Meaning these are things that in us are tied together. We know ourselves and we know God, and those things are intricately interwoven together in human beings. And so he says it's hard to even start, like, with what do you start talking about? In Calvin's Institutes, he says, okay, which one do I even primarily start addressing? So he starts with, I'm going to logically start with the knowledge of God. But he says it's really hard to say within human beings because we're at the same time aware of both realities. So he says, "For in the first place, no man can survey himself without forthwith turning his thoughts toward the God in whom he lives and moves." Acts 17:28. "But it is perfectly obvious that the endowments which we possess cannot possibly be from ourselves. Our thinking cannot possibly be from ourselves. Nay, that our very being is nothing else than subsistence in God alone." So he says, as soon as I think, our thoughts go to God. But as soon as we think about God, we realize our thoughts are not the final reality. Our thoughts are existing within God's creation and God's order and God's world. So existence in a mind that can recognize and think meaningfully about existence, the fact that we can even think, is a result of the internal revelation of the knowledge of the God of the Bible. For example, and this is why this has to be true, there's not an alternative worldview really to this. The alternative presented often is a chance universe. And a chance universe means that everything would be meaningless. And I'm not just talking about ethically or morally, like, oh, it doesn't matter if you do what's right or wrong. That's true too. But even our thinking would have no valid connecting point with the real world. It wouldn't mean anything. And so if that is true in a chance universe, our existence, our thinking in that existence, whatever the case may be, is all totally meaningless and can never be called truth, can never touch on anything that is called true. But we see meaning pervades the universe. And we have that understanding because we know God, because we know the God who is true. But let's talk about here necessary being versus what's called contingent being. God has necessary being. God has always existed. In fact, R.C. Sproul has made an interesting statement where he says it's fun to look up that video of R.C. Sproul making the case for why God does not exist. Now you say, well, wait a second. Why would R.C. Sproul say that God does not exist? He says because existence, he says we exist because existence is the state between, in philosophy, being and becoming. We change. But he says God is just pure being. He doesn't exist like have a starting point. God is just pure being, pure self-existence within himself. He's the thing from which everyone else gets their being and existence. He's the creator. No one created him. He's the eternally self-existent God. And so we as humans, we don't have necessary being. The world was going on before we were born. The world will go on after we die. The world does not depend on our existence to continue. Neither does all other reality. And so there was existence before us and there'll be existence after us. But other reality does not exist, does not stop to exist just when we're not there to experience it. But God has what's called necessary being or necessary existence. So God exists in and of himself, but we exist within God, within his world. In him we live and move and have our being. This is, listen to Exodus 3:14. When God introduces himself to Moses with his name, God said to Moses, I am who I am. And he says, thus you shall say to the sons of Israel, I am has sent me to you. You know, God's personal name, his covenant name, talking about his being, that God introduces himself that way to Moses and then to his people in this key point in redemptive history. So God's existence is what defines everything else, including our existence and our thinking. And if it didn't, our thinking would be meaningless. It would be self-contradictory, and the contradictions wouldn't matter at that point either. So it's not I think, therefore I am. I mean that doesn't work. But our thinking can depend on the God who is the foundation of all being, all existence, who created everything. Isaiah 43:10. You are my witnesses, declares the Lord, and my servant, whom I have chosen, so that you may know and believe me that I am he. Before me there was no God formed, and there was none after me. That God is the foundation of reality, that God is the foundation of truth, that there is no God besides him. There's no God before him, that there's no God after him. So it's really God's thinking and will that defines all things, not our thinking and will and our existence. Jesus also, John 8:58, when they're saying, well, Jesus is saying making all these claims, and he said, well, you're not 50 years old. How can you say that you've seen Abraham? And Jesus in John 8:58 says, Jesus said to them, truly, truly, I say to you, before Abraham came into being, I am. Jesus is saying, no, I am the God of Abraham, who was there before Abraham existed. Which goes back to John 1:3, that idea of that Abraham had a point where he came into being. Jesus did not. Before Abraham was, I am. And he uses that name of God, that identity of God, which goes back to John 1:3, that all things came into being through him, through Jesus, the Word. And apart from him, nothing came into being that has come into being. So all reality John's making this bold statement that all reality depends on Jesus as the eternally existent creator. who was always there with the Father, who was with God and was God. So both existence and thinking can only be meaningful if the reality is as the Bible describes it. Otherwise, you're left with a chance universe where none of these things matter and none of these things can have intelligible meaning. Our brains could not make sense of them. It wouldn't have any point. And so, otherwise, existence is just a changing standard, a changing target. It's just based on chance. So, for example, 2 + 2 is 4. Maybe not tomorrow. That's just a chance occurrence, right? And if that's changeable, then really all other reality doesn't matter either. And nothing can be known about the nature of reality or the mind that tries to know it. So that's the problem that you run into when you use rationalism, when you try to use reason as an independent ultimate authority rather than a tool that thinks God's thoughts like he commands us to, thinks in obedience to him. Let me read you a quote from the book Common Grace in the Gospel. This writer, Cornelius Van Til, great apologetic writer, and he talks about the theistic proofs, using reason and evidence with the unbeliever and things of that nature. But he says, okay, here's what we're trying to get at. He says, the theistic proofs therefore reduce to one proof. He says, look, all these things that we argue with unbelievers, they ultimately come down to one thing. He says, the proof which argues that unless this God, the God of the Bible, the ultimate being, the creator, the controller of the universe, be presupposed, unless you assume that before you think anything else, as the foundation of human experience, this experience operates in a void, meaning it's just totally meaningless. That he goes, unless, he's not just saying any God, he's not just saying a God who might probably exist. He's saying, no. What the Bible argues, and what we should be saying as Christians, that unless this God is the standard of all things by his nature and character, the creator and controller of the universe, then everything, if that's not true, unless you assume that ahead of time to judge everything else as an ultimate authority, he says all other thinking, all other experience operates in a void, meaning it has no meaning, it has no point, it has no significance. It cannot be possible to think in that world. And if that's the case, then philosophizing is pointless. So he says this one proof is absolutely convincing, meaning you have to, even unbelieving systems, have to assume the truth of the biblical worldview, have to assume the God of the Bible in order to argue their systems against the God of the Bible. And so that's what we're trying to show people in apologetics and evangelism. We're depending on the Holy Spirit to do the convincing work, but we're trying to show people the absurdity of any other worldview that is not brought into obedience to the gospel, brought into obedience to Christ. As we've talked about several times, 2 Corinthians 10:5, that we're fighting speculations, every lofty thought that's raised up against the knowledge of God, and bringing every thought captive to the obedience of Christ. And so the possible biblical alternative to self... So we looked at Descartes' I think, therefore I am. We could say, okay, there is something valuable that we can take out of that, but we'll rearrange it a little bit, rearrange his thoughts a little bit, knowing what we know about the God of the Bible and the biblical truth. We'll change it to, there's two different ways we could say this. We can say we think, and that's meaningful. Therefore, this isn't us anymore. This is God. There, Exodus 3:14. Our thinking is a reflection. I think, therefore, I am. Or maybe even better, because of God's being, I am. Because of who God is as the creator, the one who defines all reality, I am therefore, you think. That our thinking and all other thinking is really tied to the reality of God's existence, even if we're not consistent, even if we're resisting God in our thinking. So if that's the case, what needs to happen in that case is repentance. We need to change our thinking. We need to repent to bring our thoughts into conformity and obedience to God. So anyway, as we move on here, we'll take another couple minutes and we'll finish up with Spinoza, after kind of working our way through this area of Descartes' thinking. We'll go to Spinoza, who is a Dutch humanist, a Jewish philosopher who was expelled from the synagogue for his views, and he develops, and this is a blank there, he's responsible for developing the theory of two words, rationalistic, so just like rationalism, rationalistic pantheism. And pantheism is the worldview that all reality, God, us, physical stuff, human beings, all reality is, if there's a God, it's all kind of tied together in one ultimate kind of blob of reality. It's just everything is one. Okay, so he comes up with, so he is also, there's a blank there, this word monism, that Spinoza argued for monism, the theory that all reality is fundamentally one. Okay, so he comes up with this theory of rationalistic pantheism. But remember, Descartes, this is why I mentioned it, he's a dualist. He says there are two kind of realities. Spinoza also saying he's a rationalist. He's saying I'm using reasoning as well. He becomes a monist. All reality is just one big thing. So even God is just tied in with whatever exists. That God is just the sum total of add everything together that exists in the universe and all that kind of energy and stuff and put it all together, and whatever that is, that's what we call God. Okay, it's a unbiblical view of God. And so this rationalistic view didn't lead him to an outright rejection of God, but basically he rejects God in another way. He just says that, look, whether you call it God, nature, kind of the great mind, it was just a name for the totality of reality, that everything added together, not the transcendent creator described by the Bible. This is his statement. He says, whatever exists, is in God, and nothing can exist or be conceived without God. So we sound, okay, that sounds good at first. But remember, what he's thinking of as God is just add all the stuff together, and that's what we call God. But the problem with that is if you say, okay, add all this stuff together, and we call that God, that says nothing about who God is, what God is in particular. So it attempts to affirm the existence of a God in name, but it's actually a denial of God by redefining the terms. But this influenced Christianity because it allowed atheists and non-believers to continue to call themselves Christians, but say, well, I just have a different definition of what or who God is. It's not the transcendent creator that the Bible describes. It's just kind of the universal energy that we all share because we're all one. So you could be a Muslim and be a Christian. You can be a atheist and be a Christian. Really, all it is just we're just using terms to describe a greater reality. So anyway, that's his influence on Christianity as well. But he gives us all this stuff. He argues through, I'm going to shorten it a little bit on Spinoza here. He argues through all these things, but in the end, all he gives us are a set of definitions. Here's how he defines his terms. He doesn't prove any of it. He doesn't prove any of it by reason. And he says that in order to know any particular thing, you'd basically have to know the whole of reality. But no one could know the whole of reality unless you're omniscient. You'd have to know everything in order to know anything. And so by his own standard, his worldview falls apart. It gets a little bit more complicated, but we're not going to get too much into depth. It's just kind of a survey of his thought. We'd have to have a full awareness of all reality to know any particular area. So knowledge becomes impossible unless you're an omniscient being, which you can't be even according to his system, because we're just one little part. So the idea that you could use reason in his system to get to anything totally fails. So he demonstrates that reason could be used as a tool, but not an ultimate authority. And so it falls apart. And then we'll finish here with the Enlightenment really influences the American Revolution, the period afterward. And the focus was the idea of questioning everything, even questioning authority, whether that be of the church or the government, which you could see why this period starts to be known for revolutions. You have the English Revolution, you have the American Revolution, and you have the French Revolution. And all those were a little bit different, but the Enlightenment kind of had that idea of, well, wait a second. Why should the king, the government, be doing this or that? Why can't we do it a different way? That kind of questioning becomes key. You even see this in Thomas Jefferson's Declaration of Independence, Enlightenment thinking. He talks about, we hold these truths to be self-evident. So he argues from self-evident truths because that is the kind of order of the day as far as thinking is concerned. Let me read a quote from an encyclopedia in philosophy that talks about the Enlightenment. I think summarizes it pretty well. It says, Enlightenment is the process of undertaking to think for oneself. Okay, that's okay. But we want to think biblically. To employ and rely on one's own intellectual capacities in determining what to believe and how to act. Now that's where we run into some problems, because you have to have some standard by which to judge things to be true. And just thinking for yourself does not necessarily mean that your thinking is right. Now, we don't also want people just to think, well, I should just think this because some authority told me. However, it depends on what they're coming back to as their ultimate authority. So the Enlightenment was supposed to be this age of reason. It's even called that sometimes, to establish all this truth. Thomas Jefferson says, yeah, these things are self-evident, all this stuff. However, people come to radically different conclusions when all claiming to use reasoning. And that's not the fault of reason, but that's, and we may say people can use reason incorrectly, but everybody's claiming to use reason. The Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy goes on to say that, it explains the problems with this. I asked the question, while there's great value in thinking for ourselves apart from arbitrary authority, you don't want to just think something for no reason, are our minds and autonomous human reason sufficient to establish knowledge of the truth? Is just our thinking for ourselves good enough to really get to that, what we say it can? And even the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy, listen to this admission here. It says, for all the enduring accomplishments of Enlightenment political philosophy, American Revolution, it is not clear that human reason proves powerful enough to put a concrete, positive, authoritative ideal in place of the ideals negated by rational criticism. So in other words, it can criticize authorities, it can question things, but reason and rationalism is not sufficient to place a sufficient authority or a standard. It can't replace the authority that it takes down. And so it goes on, it says that as an epistemological domain, meaning theory of knowledge, reason shows its power more convincingly in criticizing authorities than establishing them. So reason can be good in evaluating things if we use it appropriately as a tool, but it cannot establish authority. You have to have something to think about. Okay, and then we'll finish just briefly here with the conclusions, kind of where we started with this. Reason, here's some blanks here. Reason is a God-given tool. Reason is a God-given tool to be used in submission to and dependence on God and His revelation. Like Isaiah 1:18. Come, let us reason together. Once we're reasoning appropriately, we are on God's terms. But reason cannot operate as an autonomous, independent source of authority. So that's second blank there under conclusions as authority. Reason is a God-given tool, but cannot operate independently as a source of authority. So only the biblical worldview uses reasoning appropriately in understanding its value, but also understanding its limits. So rationalism claims to be able to establish certainty by the use of reasoning from self-evident truths, but rationalistic systems contradict one another. They undermine themselves, and they lead to arbitrary conclusions rather than certainty. So if you can't get to the goal of certainty and knowledge, which is what rationalism claimed to be able to do, then it failed in its whole mission. And so this is where people get frustrated with rationalism. They say, okay, well, let's go to empiricism. When really they should say, okay, it can contribute some things. However, we need to submit our thinking to God and His revelation. Rationalism is self-defeating because it must assume the validity of reason in order to prove the validity of reason. Now, the Christian can do that because when we're reasoning, we're thinking in accordance with God's truth, thinking His thoughts after Him, and trying to bring ourselves into conformity to His reality. Rationalism also claims to utilize reason, rationalism also claims to utilize reason also led philosophers to radically diverse conclusions. So they say, hey, let's all get on the same page as far as reason's concerned. But then they all have different ideas of what reason is and where it leads them. So it runs into those problems. And let me just finish again. I quoted this verse earlier, but I have it here at the end of the notes, and we'll finish with this in our minds. That 2 Corinthians 10:5, this is what Paul is talking about. He says, we are destroying speculations and every lofty thing raised up against the knowledge of God. That's what the Christian worldview does. It's destructive of other worldviews. It says, and we are taking every thought captive to the obedience of Christ. So that's where we want our thought to be, is under the lordship of Christ, using our reason as God gave it to us as an appropriate tool, but using it as under His authority as an act of obedience in conformity to God's nature and character, not autonomous human thought. So anyway, let's close in a word of prayer and then go and worship the Lord together. Lord God, we thank You for this morning that You've given us to come together to worship You. We pray that You would cause us to love You with all of our minds, that our reason would not just be for ourselves, not just be an exercise of our thought independent of You, which we are all guilty of doing at one time or another, Lord, but that our thoughts would be under Your lordship, under the lordship of the Lord Jesus. And in His name we pray. Amen. All right.